Hello. Hi. How are you? Sorry. So this is recording. So whatever we say, it's going to be recorded.
Everything you would have. Shares out something.
Yeah. We're like even. Actually, didn't turn out.
You know what?
It's nothing to do with what I mean. Hey, I'm so sorry. I'm big. I'm stuck. That's just trying to
Started with human being. Let's go. Then it's yeah, it's called the name, but very kind of situated in yeah, they have a little dose, you know, but in 10 minutes, you have the news through the prisons. That's you know.
It's really so we don't go very later, and then it was. Here. We're getting it out. Because I have. You have back. Whatever, or this is a relaxed community. So use my laptop, so we can use your phone, whichever you prefer.
I have used.
Yeah. Also, the doctor. Sure.
Yes.
Is it timed or no?
It is.
No, I mean, like, is it, it's not. Okay, so I have this, which is a clicker. So. Oh, there we go. Right? You're gonna have entirely too much fun. Do you want a lavalier or do you want a hand? What would you prefer? I know you want her.
Today's is I'm going to actually stand.
Sometimes people are comfortable, and then sometimes they need to walk, make her.
Please give me more precision. I'll try.
Actually, very.
I'll just,
Okay, so you don't want the letter layers.
I was like, so. I didn't know.
Okay, one last word, you want to go one, you want to.
I will.
Yeah. It's cool. Oh.
Yes. Yes. I can be very. That's okay.
It's already thanks to first. I think. You like it warm. Oh, really? On the box. I know. It's not like it's on my Here on top of it. Which is interesting. Yeah. Since, you know, we have, YouTube broken. Anyway. I can get it on phone. Yeah. And then I kept the obvious right. I wanted to see what was going on. I was there. And so does he 18? And then. See, getting it. No one promise. Yeah, it was when she was. Yes. Feel free to sit anywhere. I can tell there's a lot of Catholics in the room because the kind of seats are all. All right, well, I'm gonna get started. Can y'all hear me or do I need the mic? Can y'all hear me? Okay, good. Yeah, I'm from New Jersey. We have no trouble growing our crazy crop. Well, so first of all, welcome. We're thrilled for you to be here. We're thrilled to be participating in the History Festival. We do this every year. We very much love being able to host lectures here. And we've got a really great, very talented pool of lecturers in this region. So I'm excited tonight that you're here. First of all, my name is Katie. I'm the archivist for the Diocese of St. Augustine. This is the Catholic Church here. And if anybody's heard, we have a new pope. So we're all kind of celebrating at the moment. A couple of just sort of announcements and things just to be aware of. So as I mentioned, we are participating in the History Festival. And one of the things that we really feel very strongly about is being active in the communities in our diocese, in Jacksonville, St. Augustine, et cetera. And part of that, the way that we do that is through collaboration. And so if you are floating around St. Augustine the next couple of days, you can actually see some of our bishop's vestments, which are on display at the Jimenez Fascio House. So it's part of their exhibit, Daily Rituals, Menorcan Stories, and it runs through May 17th. So stop by and check that out. Also, another thing I just kind of wanted to mention, if you're here, I expect that you have similar interests in enslavement and sort of what the community, the sort of more culturally diverse community was in St. Augustine. And as part of the History Festival this year, I hear that Port Mose has a grand opening tomorrow. They reconstructed one of the forts. So I encourage you to go out and visit them. I know it's a little bit off the beaten path, but go do it. So to get started, other things, sorry. I have two more things. Number one, you all registered. And when you registered, you gave me your email. So now I have your email address, and we actually have a newsletter that we send out. I promise you it's not going to junk up your email box. The whole purpose of it is just to let people know what's going on with the archives. So I send it out kind of when there's events and when there's things going on. We don't send it out weekly or monthly or anything. So feel free, if you haven't heard about it, you're welcome to register. I'll put you on the list, and then at the same time, you don't have to stay on the list. You can unregister if you would like. Last thing is I am keeping up a blog, just a little bit about the archives, what the archives does, what it is. We're kind of far away from the rest of the world, and so we'd like to share with you. And it's a profession that I think people don't know as much about. So it's an opportunity and educational tool for us. Okay, so long story short, we're here to listen to our distinguished speaker talk about Domingo de Jesus. And this is, in case everybody's in the right space, is Domingo de Jesus, a free life in a society of slavery. So to introduce you to our speaker, So Trevor Bryant is an assistant professor of history and director of public history at Flagler College. He specializes in Spanish colonial Florida. He received his PhD from Florida International University and an MLA in Florida students from studies from USF St. Petersburg. His research focuses on how people from Europe, Africa, and the Americas connected Florida to the wider Atlantic world and how they maintained community while traveling across the colonial borders. So I want to welcome Dr. Bryant.
Thank you so much. First, good start right off. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? I don't have to sound much. You guys can hear me? Oh, perfect. Double the voice. Thank you so much for coming out. And I want to thank Katie for setting this up, as well as the diocese for hosting this. And I want to thank you all for coming out. As a historian, we're locked away in dusty archives, talking to 18-year-olds who don't really care about this, but want to earn a good solid B in the class. So it's always refreshing to see people active in the community. So thank you so much for taking the time out for visiting. I must say, I actually feel pretty excited that today I'm giving this talk. As Katie mentioned, we have a new Pope, Pope Leo, who is the first Pope from the United States to be in that position. And specifically, he's from the order of St. Augustine. So I feel like it's a fitting connection here. And he also mentioned in his opening address to building a more inclusive church. And I found that interesting because today I am going to talk about Domingo de Jesus. He was a free man from Carolina who lived and had a quite interesting story here in St. Augustine. And in telling his story, I'm hoping to elucidate certain aspects of not only the church, but also life in St. Augustine. I must say that Domingo de Jesus is one of my favorite figures from this part of history. And today I'm actually going to give you a specific story from St. Augustine. And it's not going to be just about Domingo de Jesus. It's going to be about the people he networked with, that he knew. And in understanding his story, I'm hoping to shed a little bit more light on what life was like here in St. Augustine as a free person and as someone who was enslaved. St. Augustine, oftentimes we understand these histories by people who are entered into the record. By that, I mean people who are documented in parish records and testimonies and whatnot. But there were more people living here than those who chose to enter into the records. So in addition to talking about Domingo de Jesus, I also want to talk about those who, if not are voiceless, do appear in this, and sometimes not by choice. So what can we learn from their stories? But before we do that, let me introduce you to a very famous map. Show of hands, who have seen this map before? Second question, does anyone know where this map is displayed in downtown historical St. Augustine? Wolf's house, and across the street, or not across the street, across the way, on the complete other end of town. Yeah, it's all the way. There's a huge little courtyard. You go in there, and it's this map blown up. And this map is important because it's one of the most accurate maps we have of colonial St. Augustine. Now, this map was originally created by a former resident of St. Augustine by the name of Don Juan Joseph Eligio de la Puente. He was one of the wealthiest members of St. Augustine. He was the accountant of St. Augustine. And in 1764, he had the distinct honor of creating this map of St. Augustine. So why was this such a distinct honor? Well, who knows what was happening in Florida in 1764? It was changing hands, absolutely. Spain was on the losing end of the 7 Years' War, and as a consequence for this, they had to give Florida to the British in exchange for Havana, which the British had captured the year prior. Now, the King of Spain wanted to know, okay, what is it I am losing? How much money is this going to cost me? So he went with the guy that knew the most about money at St. Augustine and says, you will design the most accurate map of the city possible. And he did that. So if you look up here, not only is each box representing a property or a lot, you can also notice here, the sides. These sides, these margins are filled with the owners of each property in St. Augustine. It lists where exactly the property is It lists whether or not there's a building or an empty lot. It lists if there was a building, what the building is made out of. Copina, tabby, wood, wattle and dye. And it also tells you how big it was in varas. So it's like an old colonial measurement length. This map is important because of its accuracy. You can actually use ArcGIS, which is a program that maps out space onto this map and see where exactly people live down to the exact foot. When St. Augustine was first starting its reconstruction to feel more colonial in the 60s, they started with this map. So I felt like it was a good way for us to unfold this story of Domingo de Jesus. But before I get to Domingo de Jesus, I must start with a very young African by the name of Aaron Jones. Now, in the documents, it's spelled with a Y. I can't figure out if it's Aaron Jones, Aaron Jones, Aaron Johns. My gut is that it's a transliteration of the name Aaron Jones. But if I kind of like switch up the names, that's why. So our story begins in early 1750, 14 years before that map was created. And this young 19-year-old man who was enslaved to a prominent member of St. Augustine was, according to his testimony, just walking along his master's fence, running a stick across the boards, like we all do when we're bored. And then out of the corner of his eyes, he saw something weird happen. At this house right here, owned by a man by the name of Don Joseph Del Olmo. He's also my second favorite person in St. Augustine history. Mr. Del Olmo is not Spanish. He's Italian, specifically from Piedmont. Quick backstory on him. He was born in Piedmont, married an English woman, had 2 daughters, and joined St. Augustine to become the leading English and French interpreter of the city. That was his day job. The job that made him his most money was a master cooper. Not only was he a cooper, he reached the highest rank of making barrels. He was really good at that. So good that he moved to St. Augustine, had 2 daughters, and his wife died, and he remarried a very prominent widow in society. So this is an impressive person. And Aaron Jones saw at the corner of his eyes someone walking out of his house. And he thought to himself, wait a minute, that's neither Joseph Del Olmo nor his manservant, Mozo. It's some random white guy walking out of his house. And according to the testimony, this guy stopped and saw Aaron Jones, and they locked eyes. He motioned him to come over, and Aaron Jones, young, impressionable man, came over, and through sign language, they figured out they didn't understand each other. The white man spoke Spanish. Aaron Jones, despite being owned by a Spaniard, only spoke English. But they did enough sign language where they went into the house, and this man who was later identified as Pancho, I have no idea how he was found, he disappears from the records, indicated a box, a lockbox that was open in the house. He pointed to it, and there was money in this lockbox, right in this house. Turned and left. Leaves the story. Aaron Jones, however, for whatever reason, reached into the box and picked out a bag of money. There was about 80 pesos in that bag. And he proceeded to run out of the house, jump over the fences, and stayed out of the view of this building. Does anyone know what this building is? What was that? I'm sorry, I didn't hear that. It was eventually the slave market, but that specific building is the military barracks of the time. Why the military barracks? Why was he getting out of the way of that? That's where the jail was. St. Augustine was a military city. There wasn't a real judicial branch. There was no judges, no lawyers. There was the governor, who was always a military man, and he was judge, jury, and sometimes executioner. So the jail was either in the fort or in the military barracks. So he was always hiding away from that. And he traversed the environment and went back to his owner's house where he thought, I have to hide this. And what better place to hide the money than in the chicken coop? So he buried the money into the chicken coop, walked away scot-free until the morning where he was captured and brought to the barracks. Now, this is where I must say, this story, or this version of the story, is only one version he told. When I find this story, I'm finding it in a set of records. It's a compilation that is being sent from the chief curate here in St. Augustine, Juan Josef Solana, to the Bishop of Cuba about our friend Domingo de Jesus, who is yet to enter the story. And really, this is a set of interrogations. Aaron Jones was interrogated multiple times, always under the threat of death or torture. His story did change. In one version, he didn't see the man coming out. He instead was walking along, minding his business, and saw the door ajar and went into the house. Now, for me, I'm not necessarily concerned with the veracity of the story. What I'm concerned about are two things. One, who is he naming? What are those connections? And that's one of the main takeaways I want you guys to understand from this talk. How do people make connections, and how do those connections survive both space and time? And two, what was the logic of the people interrogating him? What was this Spanish logic? How did they understand these people on their own terminology and their own grounds? That's what I'm interested in. So according to a synthesis of the readings, I gather that a new person is entering this story, a man by the name of Antonio Josef. Antonio Josef is also a slave. He is enslaved to a Spanish soldier. And in fact, he has a job. He's the drummer for his master's unit. And for whatever reason, they don't say in the records, he's in the barracks. And for whatever reason, he starts talking to Aaron Jones. And Aaron Jones comes up with the bright idea of saying, hey, I don't know how much longer I can take. If you dig up the money and take it away from there so they can't find it, well, the evidence will be gone. I'll be able to get out scot-free, and we can partition it up later. Partition up later. Raise your hand if you think that he's going to do that. No, that man proceeds to walk out of the barracks, says, thank you so much, sorry about your stay, and proceeds to cut him out of the money. Now, this is a second addendum. It is asked in the records, okay, how did you know Antonio Joseph and the other conspirators I'll talk about shortly? How did you know about them? Was this a preconceived plan? And the answer was always, there was no connection between Aaron Jones and Antonio Joseph and his crew. That could be the fact that they're trying to hide the connection, make the punishment less severe. It could also be protection. Aaron Jones is 19. The rest of the men I'll talk about are in their 20s and 30s. Maybe they're protecting him. Maybe they're playing dumb. We don't know. But what we do know is something incredibly fascinating, because Antonio Joseph goes immediately to a British merchant's house. British merchant by the name of John Hume. Now, he's not looking for John Hume. He's looking for John Hume's slave. A slave to a British man living in St. Augustine, Spanish St. Augustine. And a little bit I'll talk about why I find that so intriguing. And in fact, Thomas Hume, who is the slave he's looking for, who's friends with Antonio Joseph, is sitting in the kitchen talking to his best friend, a man by the name of Francisco Sanson. There's a lot of names. I'm sorry. If I had a whiteboard, I'd write it all out. And they talk, and they're talking, and they're like, you're not. They open up the door. It's Antonio Joseph. He's like, hey, guys, guess what? I got money. Do you want to split it up? And they're like, yeah. So these two men, the slave of the British merchant, and then Francisco Sanson, who's an enslaved Afro-Antiguan, who does not live in the city. He resides in Carolina. He is in St. Augustine because he arrived through his enslaver's trading ship. He's an enslaved mariner. One of the most important jobs in the Atlantic world. So they decide to all come together to this house. Finally, we have Domingo de Jesus, after so long. This is the property, I must say, of Domingo de Jesus. Now, up here in the margin, you can see Solar de Domingo de Jesus, and then it gives the measurements of his house, 40 by 24. Anyone here know Spanish and know what solar means? Yeah, it's an empty lot. There's no building. Wait a minute, they're meeting in an empty space? Well, here's another one of those mysteries of history. This map was created 14 years after this event. It could be that the house was torn down. Or it could be that they met at Domingo de Jesus's other property in Fort Mose, the free all-black fort that's 2 miles north of St. Augustine. It's not clear to me where they meet, but they do meet in Domingo de Jesus's property. Now, who is Domingo de Jesus? He is the first free man in this story. In fact, he's a free man. He's from Carolina. He's called a Carolina Creole, so he's probably born in Carolina, who is somehow free in St. Augustine. Now, so far, it's been kind of unclear why it was Joseph del Olmo's house that they robbed. Maybe happenstance, maybe not. Does anyone want to guess what Domingo de Jesus's job is? He is a junior cooper. Remember, the day job of Joseph del Olmo is the master cooper. That connection is not really explored in the documents, but I find that this is becoming more and more murkier. But for whatever reason, Domingo de Jesus is seemingly an upstanding guy. His wife, Maria del Rosario, is from Jamaica. They got married in the Catholic Church. They were married and baptized a year prior to this event. They have multiple grandchildren, or not grandchildren, godparents, their parents to several children. They're upstanding members of the community. And it's in his space, this private space, where they devise this plan to split the money. So they split the money evenly, and it's not an insignificant sum. And then it's Domingo de Jesus' idea to burn the bag. And every version of the testimony, he's burning the bag. Get rid of the evidence, they can't charge us. And here's we have something interesting. Another moment I want to reflect on. Domingo de Jesus takes his money, goes on his merry way. Antonio Joseph, however, stops Francisco Sanson and asks him, hey, are you going back to Carolina? He's like, yeah, of course. Our ship's headed out in a week or so. He's like, can you take my portion of the money and go back to Carolina to give it back to my hermanos who are enslaved at the slave plantation that your owner owns? Now, I don't know if it's hermanos, his brothers and sisters, or it's just close friends. I can't figure that out in the documents. But here we have our first connection, our first transcolonial connection that's not always clear in the records. A man owned by a Spaniard in St. Augustine is friends with an enslaved British-owned man who is choosing to go back to Carolina to give his money back to his family, who is still enslaved in Carolina. What's more, the other man, Thomas Hume, he doesn't give his money to Francisco Sanson. Instead, he puts it in this box, a candy box, and he takes it there himself. He arranges other plans to give it back to his family members in Carolina. So we have this black market economy happening outside the gaze of the Spanish. So Francisco Sanson says, of course, takes the money, walks to the ship, into the shipyards, where he tries to place it in the keel of the ship, only to wake up the sleeping pilot, who then apprehends him. He says, what are you doing with that money? How'd you get that money? And everyone ends up back into the barracks. Everyone but one person, Domingo de Jesus, who, remember, became Catholic a year prior. So he took advantage of one of the most important rights being a Catholic afforded you, ecclesiastical asylum. He runs not to the burnt down church, not to the small parish, but to the Franciscan convent, the monastery, that today is the National Guard's barrack. And he says to the chief curate, hey, please, can I have ecclesiastical asylum? I'm in fear for my life. And the priest said, yes, my child, you can come in. And he gained ecclesiastical asylum. The governor cannot go after him because that is not God's ground. This is another thing I want to reflect upon. His ability to know quite quickly what my rights are and how to use them as a free person, as a free Catholic subject of St. Augustine. I'll finish a story in a little bit, but this gets me back to my main thesis, my main, hopefully, takeaway from the documents and what you can take away from here. These men were linked together through a web of geopolitical, legal, and economic connections that tied Africa to Carolina, Carolina to St. Augustine, and St. Augustine to the wider Caribbean and Atlantic world. These men used these international connections, accruing incredibly important information and skills in each geographic location to not only fortify their own knowledge, but to forge and maintain relationships that enabled that burglary to happen and the conspiracy to occur. Placing this case within the larger context of 18th century Spanish Florida and the imperial rivalry between England and Spain will demonstrate not only how these conspirators are passive victims, in fact, they're far from passive victims, but how they exercise their agency through their ability to manipulate their circumstances they found themselves regardless of their disparate origins and statuses. Not only do I want to look at their relationships, this is what I'm really interested in as a scholar. Mobility, the ability to traverse across boundaries physically. How were they able to carry that information with them? And do so, maintaining the relationships. Understanding this and how they operated within different legal systems and how they manipulated different geopolitical spaces to their own advantage will better elucidate the relationship between legal freedom and personal freedoms. And so today we're really going to start questioning the idea of freedom. Is that what they were after? Is that what they were doing? Were they free, or was there a different goal? Now, back to Domingo de Jesus. Don't worry, it's actually kind of a happy ending-ish. He stays in the monastery a few months outside the governor's reach. Now, I mentioned a few minutes prior that I found this document in a set of letters from the priest to the Bishop of Cuba, because apparently the priest of St. Augustine, I think it was Juan José Solana, was ticked off. He didn't like that Domingo de Jesus was staying in the monastery for so long. So he teamed up with the governor, wrote to the bishop and said, please, please, for the love of God, can we get this guy out of here? And he literally uses the phrase, idle hands make the devil's work. This isn't good. Resolve this. Now, I don't have the bishop's reply, but I do know that eventually Domingo de Jesus did reach what we would consider a plea agreement, a plea bargain with the governor. So he turned himself in, and he only received punishment that he had to go to the Fort San Marcos for hard labor for an indeterminate amount of time. Not the best punishment, but he's alive. What's more is that he survives. I actually see him again later in Cuba in 1770. When Fortin is turned over to the British, he and his family are one of the people that leave. He becomes a tobacco farmer in the village of Nueva Florida, which is a small village that the Cuban government created for the exiled community of Floridanos, people from Florida. And that's where I leave him. I don't know what else happens to him. He serves his punishment and he comes back to society and he continues on becoming a small tobacco farmer. Now, this story, like I just told you, elucidates these transatlantic connections, but it also gives me a chance to cross-list the parish records of St. Augustine with that map I showed you. And we see that St. Augustine is incredibly diverse. There are many different places in the world where people are from. Not only Mexico, Central America, South America, but Carolina, New York, Baltimore, who are living there, as well as all throughout Africa, Spain, Italy, Germany, England. Yes, even the English are living in Spanish St. Augustine. At one point in the 1730s, we actually have a visitor from Spain coming to St. Augustine, and he's astounded by the number of English merchants there, so much that he writes to the king saying, English is more common in St. Augustine than Spanish. It is not only very multicultural, it is very transient. People are constantly moving in and out. And it's not just the whole community of St. Augustine that's diverse, it's also people of African descent. One of the most important things that you learn when you're a scholar of slavery and Black society is that Africa is not a monolith. In other words, it's not unchanging. The idea of a monolith is that something is unchanging, the same from top to bottom, sideways, whatever. In reality, Africa is no different than America, than Europe, than Asia. It changes throughout time. And not only does it change, it's incredibly diverse. What's happening in North Africa is different than South Africa. People have different histories, different social cultural processes, different economies, different languages. So when we go through the parish records, we can actually start to see African markers, indicating that it's this huge part, what I would say almost half of Africa. These are where people are coming from. Now, a little caveat, because I'm a historian, I always love my caveats. These markers are Spanish markers. It's how the Spanish understand these different regions in Africa. It may not be the regions that they used, and it also may be the regions that they're adopting once they get to America to make themselves legible to authorities. Moreover, it's not only just Africans living in St. Augustine, it's also Creoles, people born in America. And they're coming from all over. Like I said, Carolina, New York, but also Antigua, Barbados, Jamaica, Curacao, Roatan, Mexico, Cuba. Now, hopefully you guys are starting to ask a question. How are you getting your numbers? Well, to answer that question for you guys, I'm getting it from this specific book. In 1735 to 1765, there is what's known as the colored baptisms, or called the African baptisms. And it's essentially a segregated parish record that the people of St. Augustine took here to record everything. Now, here's where dates are important. Why 1735? Well, prior to that, the parish records were integrated. People of African descent were next to people of Spanish descent. That wasn't that entirely uncommon. Yet in 1735, two things happened. The first thing is, well, the Bishop of Cuba came to St. Augustine, did a tour, and looked through the records, and they said two things. The first thing was, please, please, please stop using Latin. You guys are bad at it. No more Latin. You guys think you're good, you're not good. So begrudgingly, the priest said, fine, fine, no more Latin. We still see some Latin phrases, but by and large, they start writing in Spanish. And then the second thing that the bishop says, you must segregate the baptisms for better record keeping. African baptisms go with African baptisms, Spanish baptisms go with Spanish baptisms, indigenous baptisms go with indigenous baptisms. So I'm specifically looking at the baptisms, not the death records, not the marriage records, just the baptisms from this period of time. And it goes to 64 because Spain left Florida in 64. That's when they stopped that book. The reason they did that is they had this inclination to segregation is because it's actually matching this broader intellectual movement happening in the world, the Enlightenment. And this Enlightenment was this drive to essentially rigidify categories. Now, what does that mean? Well, in the 16th century, you have the Spanish show up and they start the process of intermarriage. Spaniards have children with natives. Those natives have children who then marry Africans and they have children. And essentially you have, in this colonial logic, the creation of hundreds of new races of people. The Spanish were okay for the first 200 years of the colonization, navigating that. There was much more, not multicultural isn't the word, but much more multiracial. It was okay to have people with different skin pigmentation. But then the 18th century happened. And the Enlightenment, there's this push for certainty, for clarity. And it's not just in race, but in everything. In fashion, in gender, in economics, in knowledge. How can we be definite? No more any fluidity. Or fluidity is not the right word, but no more fuzziness. If you're this, you're this. And this is where we get the creation of what is known as Costa paintings. This is where there are literally tiny portraits that are mapped out on this huge trifold. And it's basically saying, okay, if you're Spanish and you're African, you produce this. If you're Spanish and indigenous, you produce a mestizo, so forth and so forth. And they go through the entire progression. For example, if you're a mulatto, so Spanish and Black, and you marry a Spaniard, your child would therefore have to be a Morisco. And if that Morisco grew up and married another Spaniard, their child would be a Chino, of course. And yes, that really means Chinese. It doesn't actually mean from Asia. It means you theoretically had a yellowish tinge to your skin. Therefore, they would just call you Chino. And there was hundreds of these racial categories. That's what this push for segregation is. We need to define who these people are, because the race that you're ascribed at your birth theoretically is how we know what rights to give you as an empire. What does that mean? Well, these are the most common terms we see in St. Augustine. Pardo or parda means the lightest skin color. You are the furthest away from your African heritage. And according to Spain, race prior to the 18th century wasn't understood in skin pigmentation. It was understood in your geographic origin combined with your religious heritage. So the further you were from your conversion, and when I say your conversion, I mean your great-grandparents' conversion to Christianity, that indicated your race. So if you're African, theoretically, you're coming from, again, theoretically, because Africa is not a monolith, there's many different parts. It means you're theoretically coming from an Islamic or what they would call an infidel or a pagan background. So if you're a Pardo, you have the lightest skin color, meaning you're the furthest away from that heritage. If you're a Morisco, you're brownish, you're closer, and so forth and so forth. If you're Pardo, you have the most access to rights. You can join free militia. There are certain guilds and confraternities you can join. You even have the ability to petition the king to, quote unquote, clean your blood. In other words, erase any hint of Africanness so that you can become just like the old Christians of Spain and have no bar or no prohibition to joining university or the elite guilds. We do have these petitions, but this is where the word theoretically comes back. We have petitions. We don't have a completed petition. This is going to be another theme in this talk. Just because you have the right doesn't mean the right was given to you. More on that in a little bit. And this kind of talks about this idea of rights. So let's zoom back into Florida. Why were these people here in Florida in the first place? And that goes back to these two guys, Charles II and Philip V. These were both kings of Spain from two different backgrounds. Good old Charles here, with a face only a mother could love, is a Habsburg. In fact, he's the last Habsburg. The reason why I make that joke is that he's the product of a couple hundred years of inbreeding. He really could not function as a human being. He had pretty much anything you could think of. And obviously he did not have any children. So when he died, the Habsburgs lost their claim to the throne. Enter in the Bourbons from the French style, from the French royalty. And then you have Philip and his kin. Now, what do these two guys have to do with slavery and with Florida? Well, Spain has been in this part of America for the longest time. They established St. Augustine in 1565, and they went along about their day, meeting with indigenous people, bringing in Africans for slaves, and then also having quite a large free community here as well. And then the British come, 1609, and then the British start bringing in African slaves in 1617. The British have a different understanding of slavery. Because Spain has different races, that also means you have different access to rights, which means if you're a slave, you have rights. Slavery in Spain means you're the lowest caste. It's a social and religious stigma. It's only partially an economic stigma. In England, however, which is starting to get into plantations and capitalism, they're starting to understand slavery different. It's no longer a social stigma, it's an economic stigma. And if you're a product, you don't have rights. So you have two competing ideologies about slavery. Now, the British are going to show up in this part of the world, in Virginia and Carolina. They're going to start bringing in slaves, building plantations. The Spanish are going to raid the plantations. They're actually going to steal slaves. But the moment they start stealing slaves, do you know what happens? Other slaves follow along with them. In fact, they find canoes and they row down the St. John's and other rivers and they come here. And these slaves go to the governor of Florida and say, I request ecclesiastical asylum. The same concept Domingo de Jesus was doing in 1750. Now, why are they doing this? They're doing this not necessarily to gain manumission, but to prevent them going back to British control. They would go to the governor and say, I request ecclesiastical asylum. If I go back, they're going to kill me or hurt me. And they don't want me to become Catholic. So the governor, a good Catholic man, says, okay, yeah, I won't give you back. A, I can't deny you Catholicism. That's a moral issue. But B, I like sticking it to the British. So they take him in. He assigns these people to positions that they do. So he's like, okay, what do you do for a living? I'm a cooper. I'm a domestic. I'm a ranch hand. He's like, finds people in the community to send them to. And they live in this sort of nebulous slave, but not really a slave state. Sometimes they're paid, sometimes they're not, but they're not quite free yet. This is a process that's going to develop over time. And of course, the British show up saying, hey, give me back my slaves. The governor's like, no, I can't. They're married. See, they're married in the community. I can't give them back. I'll pay you. I don't have the money on me. Come back in a year and I'll pay you in a year. And of course, they come back in a year and it's just delayed. Eventually, the governor of Florida and really the treasurer of Florida is like, is this legal? Am I allowed to do this? So they write to the king, this guy, and say, can we do this? And this guy, and when I say this guy, I really mean his counselors say, yes. And so they declare this decree, the royal decree of 1693. And it's not just applying to Florida, it's applied to anywhere there's a borderland. Cuba, Venezuela. Any slave coming from an enemy, the British, the French, the Dutch, who wants to find Catholicism, agua de Dios, that's how they're phrasing it, water of God, and are scared of for their lives, will be accepted. We will pay the British or whoever for their loss of their property, and then they can be brought up in the Catholic tradition here in St. Augustine. And later that was clarified to say, eventually you'll get your liberties, i.e. your manumission. Not the word freedom, manumission. So the British did this, or the Spanish did this. It caused a lot of friction with the British. They actually invade Florida over this in the War of Jenkins' Ear. And eventually this has to be clarified again with this guy who came in, was like, this is a great policy. I love it. The British hate this, which means I love it even more. And he clarifies it and says, okay, if you come and you become Catholic and you're a man and you join the Free Black Militia, I'll give you manumission. I get a soldier who will shoot at the British, who will never run away, and you get your freedom. So this is actually a pretty provocative policy, and it's one that historians love talking about. In fact, if you ever read a history of Florida, chances are they'll start talking about this. Now, this raises a very interesting issue. But before I do that, I just want to show you the records. Just looking solely at the baptismal records from that 30-year period, I tracked it down from people who say they're born in Carolina and come down here. So I'm kind of assuming they're looking for asylum here. Anything we notice with this graph? Does this seem like a lot? Right. I will say this is only a tiny sliver, and this doesn't say who got their freedom. It just said who's from Carolina. So there is that caveat. Also, I did not want to do the time to go through the marriage records, the death records, because that means you have to then throw duplicates. It's a headache. But this isn't a lot. I think this shows rather that this is successful, but it's a successful trickle. And we can actually mark out certain events. So for example, you'll see right here, it's 1467, 1111, 243, and then it goes back up to 10. What's happening there? Well, Florida's getting invaded by James Oglethorpe from Georgia. So of course that would decrease the amount. But this also raises another issue. Is freedom and asylum the same thing? Yes, the governor would always, or not always, but would most of the time take the people in. But then years later, we will get records, letters from these people who were taken in, who are in this nebulous state, and they'll say, hey, we became Catholic, we are married, we have children, we have godparents, we have godchildren. Freedom, please, according to the liberty that you must give me, the king's liberty. And the governor said, let me think about it. And the slave said, like, okay, while you're thinking about it, we're going to write to the king of Spain. And so the governor's like, oh, yeah, no. Yeah, here's your freedom. Here's your freedom letters. And this was usually done over the protesting of the people in the city who are losing their labor. Just because you have your freedom doesn't mean that there isn't resistance. In fact, just because you have a right doesn't mean it's going to be afforded to you. You have to take it. So we're seeing in the first period of St. Augustine, this tension happening over freedom. Yes, we like freedom from a geopolitical lens, but on the ground, in reality, it's more complex. People are fighting for freedom, and the governor's always hesitant to give them out. Also, we're seeing something else, something that I find more interesting, something that speaks to the actions not of Domingo de Jesus, but to the actions of Francisco Sansa, Antonio Joseph, and Thomas Hume. We are finding many people coming to St. Augustine who are slaves who don't request manumission. This is why I want to highlight their stories again. You have John Hume. He's a slave of a British merchant living in St. Augustine. Why doesn't he walk across the street and claim manumission? Why do you have Francisco Sansa, who's not only coming to St. Augustine outside of his master's scope, but then choosing to go back? And this is summed up, I think, quite nicely by what's happening in a specific case that I see in Cuba, or that historians have found, like in Cuba. You have a group of people coming to Cuba to request asylum. It takes them 10 years before they even mention freedom. But do you know what they immediately say? We want agua de Dios. Freedom and slavery aren't opposites. Community and slavery are opposites. Access to the Catholic Church meant you could codify your family relationships and have access to the law. Under Spanish doctrine, you couldn't separate families that were enslaved. Caveat, there are ways around that for enslavers, and you do see instances of that happen. Under Spanish law, you can have your marriage to your significant other legalized. You can find godparents for your children to take care of them after you pass, or to fund them, because you don't always pick another person who's African who's your godparent. Sometimes you pick the wealthiest person in the town. Sometimes it's the governor. So we oftentimes see people seek community. And that helps us understand this paradox a little bit more. In Spain's paradoxical role with this policy, there are about 12 million people who were trafficked from Africa to the New World. Now, it's 12 million people were trafficked. That does not mean 12 million people survived, but around 12 million people were trafficked. Spain, which had this policy to free people, or to at least manumit them, also was the largest participant in the slave trade. They received the most slaves. So this is a question I always ask my students to write an essay on. They don't always answer well on that, but it's this paradox. Why would these freedom seekers try to find manumission freedom in a place that was the largest participant in the slave trade? And there's a couple answers to that. One of the largest answers is the church. You could codify your relationships with others. But then there's also this, and this is something that we have to understand our historical timeline. For most of human history, slavery was not to be desired. No one wanted to be a slave. It's not until the late 17th century and 18th century when we see the rise of abolitionism and Rise of Abolition, Logic and Rhetoric, where we see the institution of slavery as an actual institution become evil. So during this time, you have people who don't want to be a slave, but understand how to navigate a slave society, to leverage slavery, like we see with Francisco Sanson, who has to do this because he's enslaved, but is doing it to help his friends, to form community. Just because you don't want to be a slave doesn't mean that slavery has been demonized yet. And in fact, it's much later where we as a humanity, as society agree, yeah, slavery, not a good thing. We don't like it anymore. It is bad for people, it's bad for society. But we as historians have to understand this transition. So with all this context, the fact that people are seeking community, sometimes legally, maybe not legally, but also having to navigate this very treacherous terrain where even if you have your freedoms papers, that doesn't mean that you escape suspicion. Let's now go back to Domingo de Jesus. Domingo de Jesus was one of the most prominent members of society, not one of the most prominent members, but a very prominent member of society. This is his marriage record, taken a year prior to his wife, Maria del Rosario. He was a free person. He owned not just one property, but two properties. In Spain, you could own properties if you were of African heritage. And he used that to create private spaces, safe spaces for his family and for his friends, to sometimes hatch illicit conspiracies, but maybe just to break bread, to always be outside that gaze. It's quite telling that Aaron Jones in his testimony said, I always stay out of the sight of the barracks. That suspicion was visible, was palpable to him. It was a safe space. He also participated in godparentage. He had 3 or 4 godchildren. What does it mean to be a godparent? You give to them. You support them if their parents die. You educate them. It's also a way to formalize social prestige. There are studies done in Puerto Rico in colonial Puerto Rico that show those who engage in godparentage are showing, they're signaling to potential spouses, I'm a responsible person. It's a way for them to perform society, ways that they would not be able to underneath the English. But also, it's these guys that I'm most particularly fascinated in. It's not just a legalized mobility that Spain is advocating for. Come here, we'll knock you back to the British, but it's also this suspect mobility. Well, you can come here because St. Augustine's transient. You can form these relationships because of this mobility, of this asylum, but it can be suspect. These men were operating both because of and despite the institution of slavery, navigating their terrain. Antonio Joseph maintained his friendship with those in Carolina. That wasn't torn asunder. Francisco Sanson leveraged his position as an enslaved mariner, which historians say is one of the most important jobs people who were enslaved had. They had access to information and to community. They could maintain community. They could forge and maintain that bond. We even have Thomas Hume. Why didn't he simply walk across the street? Maybe he could leverage his position as a slave of a British merchant. Maybe not. We don't know. That's illegible to me. Again, I'm interested in seeing these connections. I wish there was more in the records, but this is the case. In St. Augustine history, we oftentimes focus on those who are in the record, who choose to be in the record, like Domingo de Jesus, who chose to become Catholic, who chose to own property, who chose to become a prominent person in society. We could write history about them. Many people have. But what about Antonio Joseph? What about Hume? What about Sanson? They never chose to be entered into the record, but that does not mean that their stories did not exist. These men's actions planned across colonial boundaries demonstrate that they expressed a freedom, an agency outside the law. Black agency within the Atlantic history is often understood through individuals' relationships to slavery and freedom. I'm asking you to broaden that understanding a little bit. One needs to be careful not to oversimplify historical figures' motivations or the relationship to enslavement. Sanson and Hume had the ability to travel between Spanish Florida and British Carolina to achieve a goal that lay outside slavery's confines. Yet it was through their enslavement that they had these opportunities. It was a confinement. They utilized mobility to achieve a goal both regardless of their status and because of their status. Both to achieve a personal freedom and not to achieve a political freedom. Black agency should not always be linked to the pursuit of legal freedom. Instead, we must understand how they're accruing knowledge and relationships in different places. These men perform the actions of what famous historian Jan Landers and Ira Berlin have called the Atlantic Creole. People who displayed cultural plasticity, social agility, linguistic or polylistic skills to navigate an incredibly shifting, complicated world. Yes, but that can also be done outside the records. These men learned multiple languages and customs, and that allowed them to commit this crime, not only as a means to achieve personal freedom, but also in studying this, we can see a broader, complicated world of colonial St. Augustine. Thank you. I'd say, a lot of names and dates, so if you don't know the process, that's okay. Yes.
All of the money. Should I was he follow?
I believe it was 87 pesos. Or no, I'm sorry, I take that back. It was 160 pesos. So that divided amongst 5 men. Yeah, yes, exactly.
We know anything about the wave of Florida and Cuba?
Yeah, so there's been, oh, say that again?
What happened to those people?
Yeah, very good question. So we do know what happened. It wasn't nice. Like you're in charge of Havana, and you're like, oh, great, we have this whole other city coming. They get the bad spot. So it was very hard, very tough. A lot of the people who set up homesteads there struggled. Caveat, again, those that stayed there. Many people in Florida had connections to Cuba already, and they went and left during those connections. For example, Juan Jose Feligo de la Puente, do you think he set up a farm? No, he went back to his family manor in Cuba, in Havana. So for those who lived in Nueva Florida, it was hard, but many people didn't. It's also important to note that many people living in Florida were part of the military. So they oftentimes went where the military took them. There was one guy who actually stayed in Cuba. In Florida, he came to Florida as a lieutenant, left a captain, and died in Havana several years later as a lieutenant colonel. So people were also moving out. So just depended where. Yes.
What did you say that is here in the city?
So I will say there are a couple of them. So does everyone know where Colonial Oak is on St. George Street? Across the street, there's a little patio plaza. If you walk in there, it's mapped right there. It actually tells you the story of how archaeologists, city planners, historians in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s used the map to start to excavate the city. So it's there, and then it's also in smaller places throughout the town. It's everywhere. Yes.
Did it say what positions were in the map?
It did not. That's a very good question. They don't. They just are wiped off the map, as far as I can tell. No, a caveat that I got these records as a set of correspondence going to the Bishop of Cuba. So that meant that the guy who was assembling it, the priest, was cherry picking which record. So I don't have access to all the colonial records. I have no idea if they still exist or not. But in those cases, they only mentioned the testimonies that dealt with Domingo de Jesus, not anything else. For example, Pancho, the white guy. I have no idea how they found him. I thought he was a figment until I read in the like a notary scribe, like, oh yeah, we found him. His name is Pancho. We have no idea how he's related to Aaron Youngs. So there is other information out there, but I can only work with what I have. I guess.
When it comes to Augustine, and since he's given me two people say that slaves were free, if it were lost.
Yes, so I think to answer that question, it's a yes, but you also look at time. When did they do it? What happens if they die? In every single case, when they would take it in, the governor asked them, what do you do for a living? And he assigned them to someone. Sometimes they were paid for their work, sometimes not. But again, you have to remember, in Spanish St. Augustine, at least in this time, slavery is more of a social condition than an economic position. It was less about property and more about know your place. You're part of my dependency, my household. People don't want to lose their household prestige. They don't want to lose their dependence because that makes them look less important, as well as the economic features. So it's when they became slaves. And I have not found a case in St. Augustine. I have read about cases otherwhere, like in Cuba, where the governor denied asylum for whatever reason. So to go back, the case that I found, or that I found of, Bertones Lane found it. No. There we are. In 1751, there were 10 fugitive African slaves. The story behind this was a case study that was found by Fernona Bertones Lane in the University of Florida. And these 10 slaves came from Jamaica, went to Cuba, said, it's asylum, please. And the governor said, no. Walked them back to the ships in Havana. And they made such a fuss, such a commotion, that the Bishop of Cuba himself ran down to the street, was galvanized, and said, what? We're denying your access to Catholicism? Halted it and interviewed them over the next month about their intentions. And he declared, yeah, no, you guys are legit, you stay. So it's also access to the church and whether or not the church could check the governor, because the church and the governor rarely got along, especially in Cuba and in Florida. So it depends on access to church, it depends on time, and it depends on access about whether or not they believe you. One record I do have, again from Cuba, I apologize, is there's this one guy who was like an enslaved mariner who was coming from an Antiguan ship. And he like ran away, hid in the mangroves in Cuba, found a fisherman, walked up to the fisherman, communicated, and the fisherman's like, you know what, I'm taking you to my brother's plantation. I'm arresting you and turning you in because I don't know what's happening. So he goes to the chief military officer, who's the lieutenant captain of the chief to the regional manager, comes and interviews him and says, okay, why do you want to become Catholic and why do you want to live here? Now, this man who does not speak Spanish, so there's a translator, says there's a translator. If I go back to Jamaica, I'll be hanged. And then it says, and to the second part, I'm not satisfied. This is also a case of perspective in the documents. Is it him saying, I'm not satisfied with my current religion? Is it the interpreter saying, I'm not satisfied with this answer? Is it the scribe saying, I'm not satisfied with the answer? Is it the chief inquisitor saying, I'm not satisfied? I don't know. All I know is that he was not given asylum and he was resold back into slavery. So sometimes it comes down to belief. I saw another hand. Yes.
So, is there a relationship between life in Spain and the various different social castes, or less, lack of a better word, and what was going on here?
Absolutely, 100%. So the Casta system was based on the notion that Old Christian Spanish, which is different from Moorish Spanish, which is different from Converso Spanish, is the pinnacle of society. And so all theoretical social prestige emanated from Spain. So that's why when we see the Latin American independence wars, the chief instigators are the Creoles, Spaniards living in Latin America, and the Peninsulares, people from Spain fighting against each other. So yes, there is that connection of like, okay, who has heritage or patronage from the homeland, for lack of a better word, that did inform a little bit about their prestige. who had access to the crown, essentially. Yes.
Fascinated by the group that was going to write to the king. And,
Yes.
you know, that then made me think that there was some level of education.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That was a good catch. So when you learn Catholicism, you do have to learn basic literacy. You have to learn how to read and write so you can do your daily religious stuff. So there is a degree of education. Now, how much education is varied. Sometimes they wouldn't actually write the letters. They would hire a scribe. So being a scribe is an actual job in St. Augustine. It's a very important position. So they would just hire him. So I think that also speaks more to the fact that in Spain, you did technically have off time if you were a slave. You were not allowed to work on the Sabbath for your master. You still had to do your side jobs. And many slaves did have side jobs that they did. So raise money to either pay commission or to pay for scribes to apply for commission. So sometimes it might not be an actual written literacy, but there is a knowledge of the law, and that's what's important. Yes.
Did Spain practice whipping and those kinds of things, lashes like the English did, or was that out of bounds then in relation to their charges?
Yes. The issue wasn't that you couldn't whip a slave. The issue was that you couldn't whip a slave too severely. So that's the issue. There's a case that Jane Landers talks about in her book that you should read, Black Society in Spanish Florida, where it's a very brutal case, but there's this woman who is impregnated by her owner. He raped her. And she was caught trying to kill her baby. Huge scandal in society. The governor came and he's like, why are you killing your baby? She's like, I was raped by my owner. And the governor's like, are you kidding me? You're not supposed to do that. Again, just because you have a law doesn't mean that it's followed. So he goes to the owner, and the owner's like, well, you know, and clearly he did it, but he's disseminating a little bit. So you know what the punishment was? He gets fined, she gets whipped. Just because slavery is a social stigma doesn't mean that you're not at the bottom of society.
All right.
On a sobering note. Thank you.
All right, well, we want to say thank you so much, and there's two more things I just want to mention real quick. So I'm really thankful, Dr. Bryant, because a lot of the records that are in the diocese custody actually showed up on the screen today. So we're really proud to be custodians of the oldest Catholic records in the country. They start in 1594 and they go through about 1880. I say that specifically because they've been digitized. So they're actually available online. And they're available online in two different places. The first one is the Slave Society's digital archives. It's Jane Landers, who Dr. Bryant had just mentioned. She and some of her grad students came in and helped us digitize them, and they're all available there. And then another professor who's from Florida Southern University, who I'm sure you worked quite closely with, yes. Dr. Michael Francis, who we all know well here in St. Augustine. He and his group during COVID, it was a gift to us. They transcribed into modern Spanish and then translated all of those records. So those are available through the Interactive Digital Archives of the Americas. So I'll follow up this event with just sort of links to those individual. If you want to, check them out, you can do some genealogy and whatnot in the area. There's a lot of really interesting things written. The Golden Book of Menorcans is also in there. And then the last thing I was going to say, I just blew it out of my mind. Obviously, it was not that. Oh, I know. We are recording this session, so we're going to figure out a way to make it available. And once it's available, I'll make sure that you have access to it. So thank you very much. We appreciate you coming, and enjoy the rest of the History Festival.
Yeah, sorry.
You do have contact information about this. I mean,
But I never see.
Is you a place?
Sure, that's not easy.
And there's images of it all. Like, so the university.
Yeah.
Oh.
Okay. Okay.
I'll send it, actually, send it out to. Okay.
Yeah, but it's. Technically, for forms we didn't do it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Where are you from? Oh.
I've seen that, don't see it now. And went to undergraduate in South Carolina, so it was the Georgia plantation system, and so that I got the kids moving